The laundry sent back unwashed. A Miss Marple puzzle. Chapter 1. The basket that came back wrong. The fog had not lifted by 9, and Nether Cumden went about its morning half blind. Voices carrying oddly through the white. A dog barking somewhere near the mill, without ever quite becoming visible. Ivy Trelawney stood at her own back step with a wicker basket balanced on her hip, frowning at it as though it had insulted her. "It's not right," she said, to no one, because there was no one to hear her but the fog and the drip of the guttering. "It's simply not right." The basket held 6 of her husband's shirts, folded with the particular crispness that only Miss Bartlett's laundry achieved, and 1 linen tablecloth that had gone to be washed a full 9 days ago and had come back, this morning, unwashed, not merely unironed, unwashed. There was still, faintly, the ring of spilled sherry near the hem, exactly where Ivy remembered it. She turned the tablecloth over twice, as though the stain might have moved, then carried the whole basket down the lane to find out why. Miss Bartlett's cottage sat where the lane bent toward the ford, low and thatched, with a laundry yard behind it strung, on a fair day, with sheets that snapped like sails. On a foggy day like this one they hung limp and grey, barely visible, and it was through this curtain of damp linen that Ivy pushed her way, calling out as she went, "Miss Bartlett, it's Ivy Trelawney. I've a bone to pick with you about my tablecloth." No answer came. The sheets swayed faintly, though there was no wind to speak of, only the slow settling of the fog itself. Ivy found her in the wash-house, and afterward could never quite explain to Inspector Neal why she had known, before she had properly seen, that Miss Bartlett was dead. Perhaps it was the stillness of the copper's fire, gone entirely cold, when Miss Bartlett always kept it burning by 7. Perhaps it was the smell, not of soap and steam as it ought to have been, but of nothing at all, a room with no living breath moving through it. Agnes Bartlett lay on the flagstones between the mangle and the copper, on her back, one hand still loosely closed around a wooden clothes peg, as though she had been in the ordinary middle of an ordinary task, when whatever happened to her, happened. Her face was calm. That was the detail Ivy kept returning to, in the weeks that followed, whenever anyone asked her to describe it. She looked calm. She looked as though she'd simply decided to lie down. There was no wound Ivy could see, no blood, no disorder, beyond a single overturned basket of dry washing, its contents spilled and trodden faintly, as if someone had stepped across it in the dark without troubling to look where they put their feet. Ivy did not scream. She was a sensible woman, the wife of the village solicitor, and she had helped lay out her own mother not 4 years before. She set down her basket very carefully on the wash-house step, so as not to disturb anything, and went to fetch Constable Hobbs, walking fast but not running, because running seemed, somehow, disrespectful. Behind her, unnoticed, the sheets on the line went on swaying, very slightly, in an air that had no business moving at all. By 11 the fog had thinned to a grey gauze, and word had gone round Nether Cumden in the way word always did, not by any single mouth but by a kind of collective absorption, so that by the time Miss Jane Marple came down from her cottage to the post office for her stamps, the woman behind the counter already knew, and told her, before Miss Marple had so much as opened her purse. "Poor Agnes Bartlett," said Mrs. Higgs, lowering her voice though the shop was empty. "Found dead this morning, in her own wash-house, if you please. Ivy Trelawney found her, gone to complain about a tablecloth that never got washed at all, and there was poor Agnes lying there as though she'd just laid down for a nap." "Dead," said Miss Marple. She had a way of repeating a single word that seemed, somehow, to draw out everything a person had left unsaid. "How very sad. She always seemed such a quiet person. I don't believe I ever heard her raise her voice in the whole time I've known her." "That's just it," said Mrs. Higgs, warming now. "Quiet as a mouse. Never a word to say against anyone. Never a word for anyone either, if it comes to that. Kept herself to herself since her sister died. Must be, 15 years now. Just her and the washing, and that old cat of hers. Who'd want to harm a woman like that?" "Who indeed?" said Miss Marple, and paid for her stamps, and did not for the moment say anything further, though there was a small, attentive stillness about her, the stillness of a woman filing away a fact for later use, that Mrs. Higgs, had she been watching more closely, might have found faintly unsettling. "There's talk already, of course," Mrs. Higgs went on, unable to help herself, "that it might have been that tramp seen on the Amesbury Road. Mr. Fielding at the garage says he turned a rough-looking fellow away from his door not 4 days back, asking for work and not liking it when he was refused." "Tramps are so very convenient," Miss Marple said mildly, "for explaining things nobody wishes to look at too closely near a home. I dare say the poor man is halfway to Salisbury by now and knows nothing whatsoever about it." Miss Marple walked home along the water-meadow path rather than the lane, which took her, by pure coincidence of geography, past the bottom of Agnes Bartlett's garden, where a constable now stood at the gate looking cold and important, and where the washing, Ivy Trelawney's spilled basket among it, she supposed, still hung motionless on the lines, waiting for someone to decide what ought to be done with a dead woman's unfinished work. She paused at the gate for only a moment, long enough to notice that one of the lines, nearest the wash-house door, was entirely bare, not because nothing had been pegged to it, she thought, but because something had very recently been taken down. She noticed, too, a single wooden peg lying in the mud of the path, some 6 feet from the nearest line, as though it had been dropped by someone walking quickly and in the wrong direction for hanging washing at all. She said nothing to the constable. She simply looked for a moment, in the particular way she had of looking at very ordinary things as though they might, if given the chance, tell her something rather extraordinary, and then she went on home to put the kettle on, because there was nothing else, at 11:30 on a foggy Tuesday, that a respectable elderly lady could usefully do. Inspector Neal of the county force arrived from Devizes a little after 1, driving a car that got stuck twice in the lane on account of the mud, and by the time he reached the wash-house, his temper was not improved by the fog, the mud, or the fact that the local doctor, a young man named Fenwick, new to the district and rather too eager to demonstrate his competence, had already reached a confident conclusion. "Suffocation," Dr. Fenwick said, crouching by the body with the air of a man enjoying himself rather more than the circumstances warranted. "See here, the petechiae in the eyes, the slight bruising at the corner of the mouth, consistent with a hand or a cloth held hard and held long. Not strangled, no marks on the throat at all. Smothered. I'd say sometime between 6 and 8 this morning, given the state of things." "Smothered," Neil repeated, looking down at the small, neat, ordinary woman on the flagstones, who did not look, in death, like a person who could have inspired violence in anyone. "In her own wash-house. At 6 in the morning, doing the wash. That's about the size of it, yes. And nothing taken? No sign of a struggle to speak of? One basket knocked over, that trodden bit of linen there. Otherwise, no. Whoever did it quickly, and did it, I should say, from behind, or from very close range. She may not have had time to properly fight. There's this too, though I don't know what to make of it." Fenwick held up, with a pair of tweezers borrowed from his bag, a single wooden clothes peg from among the fallen washing, examining it with more curiosity than the object seemed to warrant. "Nothing on it. I only wondered." Neil straightened, looked round the small stone room with its coppers and mangle and the neat rows of shelved irons, and felt, not for the first time in his career, the particular unease of a crime that had happened somewhere entirely too ordinary. Murder, in his experience, liked its proper settings: dark alleys, locked studies, lonely roads. It did not, as a rule, choose a laundrywoman's wash-house on a foggy Tuesday morning, among the smell of soap flakes and starch. "Who," he said, half to himself, "goes and murders the washerwoman?" It was a question, as it turned out, that would take him the better part of a fortnight to answer, and it would be answered in the end, not by him at all, but by a small elderly lady with pink cheeks and faded blue eyes, sitting very quietly in the corner of Ivy Trelawney's drawing-room, with a piece of knitting she rarely seemed to actually knit, listening to everyone talk. Chapter 2. What the village knew, and what it only thought it knew. By Wednesday, Nethercomben had produced no fewer than 4 confident theories regarding the death of Agnes Bartlett, and Miss Marple, over the course of one morning's shopping, heard all 4 and would hear each of them a dozen times more before the week was out. The first, offered by the butcher's wife over a joint of mutton, held that it was a tramp. There had been a tramp seen on the Amesbury Road only the week before, and everyone knew what tramps were capable of when refused a meal. Mr. Bunting the butcher, cutting chops behind her, added his own contribution, that he had heard, from a carter passing through, that the very same man had been seen again, only that Monday evening, loitering near the ford. Miss Marple, listening with polite interest, noted privately that the story had grown a full day's worth of new detail in the space of a single telling, which was, she had long observed, precisely how village rumour behaved. Like a snowball rolled downhill, gathering weight it had never actually possessed at the top. The second, from the woman who kept the sweet shop, was rather more romantic. Agnes Bartlett had once, long ago, been engaged to a man who went to the war and never came back to marry her, and perhaps he had come back, after all, changed by whatever he'd seen, and something had gone terribly wrong between them. "There was a soldier billeted here in the last war, you know," the woman confided, wrapping a twist of barley sugar with great solemnity. "Name of Corrigan, and I always did think Agnes had a soft spot for him, though nothing ever came of it that anyone saw." The third theory, murmured rather than spoken, suggested that Agnes had been keeping money under her mattress. Laundresses always did, didn't they? And some local ne'er-do-well had gone in after it and been surprised at his work. This one gained a certain grim currency at the ironmonger's, where 2 farm hands debated at some length which of the village's less reputable young men might have been desperate enough for money to try such a thing, without ever quite settling on a name, for the very good reason, Miss Marple privately thought, that neither of them actually believed it. The fourth theory, and the one Miss Marple found most interesting precisely because the woman offering it seemed so anxious to offer it, came from Mrs. Prue Cardew, who ran the small circulating library from the front room of her cottage, and who cornered Miss Marple by the greengrocer's with a great deal of unnecessary urgency. "Of course you'll have heard she'd had words with young Sam Willett," said Mrs. Cardew, in the tone of a woman imparting a great confidence to the whole street. "Only last week. Everyone in the shop heard it. Sam, wanting his father's Sunday suit back a day early on account of the harvest supper, and Agnes telling him flatly she couldn't have it done, and Sam saying some very ugly things indeed. You know how the Willett temper runs." "Did he?" said Miss Marple, in her mildest voice. "How very unpleasant for Miss Bartlett. Though I must say, Mrs. Cardew, quarrelling over a Sunday suit does seem rather a small thing to lead to, well, to that." "Small things lead to large things," said Mrs. Cardew, with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had settled the matter. She hesitated, then, glancing quickly up and down the street as though to be sure no one else was near enough to hear. "Though I will say, Agnes had grown a little strange with me too this last while, sharper than she used to be. I brought my library books round to her only a fortnight since, quite as I always did, friendly as you like, and she was short with me in a way I never knew her to be before. Snapped at me, if you want the truth of it, over nothing at all. A book left a day late. How very unlike her," Miss Marple said, watching Mrs. Cardew's face with rather more attention than the small confession seemed, on its face, to deserve. "I wonder what could have put her out of temper so." "I couldn't say," said Mrs. Cardew, a shade too quickly, and swept off toward the post office to repeat her Sam Willett theory to whoever she found there, leaving Miss Marple to reflect, not for the last time, that a person who volunteers one small confidence, unprompted, in the middle of pointing suspicion firmly at somebody else, is very often a person managing rather more anxiety than the confidence itself would explain. Miss Marple, left alone by the greengrocer's cabbages, allowed herself a small private smile, not of amusement exactly, but of the particular pleasure she took in observing how very eager people were to explain a thing they did not understand by fitting it to the nearest thing they did understand, a quarrel, a grudge, a hot temper. It was, she reflected, rather like Mrs. Casey at St. Mary Mead years ago, who had been perfectly certain that a broken greenhouse pane meant the vicar's son had been at his cricket practice again, when in fact the pane had been broken quite deliberately by quite another person for quite another reason altogether. People wanted their explanations small and their neighbours essentially harmless. It made the world so much easier to live in. She bought her cabbage and a pound of the good streaky bacon and walked on to Ivy Trelawney's for the tea she had been rather firmly invited to, turning over, as she went, the small odd fact of Prue Cardew's late library book, and finding that it sat, uncomfortably, at the back of her mind, refusing quite to be dismissed. Ivy Trelawney's drawing room that afternoon held more people than tea alone would account for, which was, Miss Marple suspected, precisely Ivy's intention. Grief and shock in a small village wanted company, and company wanted an audience for its theories, and Ivy, having found the body, felt herself entitled to preside over both. There was Ivy herself, still faintly pale, dispensing tea with the particular energy of a woman working off a considerable fright. There was her husband, Gerald Trelawney the solicitor, saying very little and drinking a lot of tea very quickly. There was the vicar, Mr. Aldous Pym, a thin, kindly, ineffectual man who kept saying, "Such a terrible, terrible thing," at intervals as though the phrase were a form of prayer. There was Dr. Fenwick, invited perhaps for his professional gloss on events, clearly enjoying his notoriety rather more than was quite decent, describing the petechiae in the eyes to anyone who would listen with a relish that made the vicar wince. There was Sam Willett's mother, Nora Willett, sitting very stiff and upright near the window, saying almost nothing, which Miss Marple thought interesting, given that her son's name was, by now, on nearly everyone's lips. There was Prue Cardew herself, arriving a little after Miss Marple and settling near the fire with the air of a woman determined to steer the conversation firmly wherever she wished it to go. And there was, arriving rather later and rather flustered, a woman Miss Marple did not immediately know, introduced by Ivy as Miss Dinah Colley, who does the church flowers, you know, and was such a friend to poor Agnes. It was Dinah Colley, Miss Marple noted, who seemed the most genuinely distressed of anyone in the room, hands not quite steady around her teacup, eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested real weeping rather than performance. She was a woman of perhaps 45, plainly dressed, with the slightly apologetic manner of someone accustomed to being overlooked. "I saw her only Monday evening," Dinah said, to no one in particular, staring at her tea. She seemed quite herself, a little preoccupied perhaps, but quite herself. "Preoccupied how, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, so gently that it scarcely seemed a question at all. Dinah looked up, as if surprised to find herself addressed. "I don't know, Miss Marple. She'd had a letter that morning, the second post, I think, and she didn't say what was in it, only that she'd have to think what to do about something. I asked if there was anything wrong, and she said no, nothing wrong, only something she'd have to see. I didn't press her. Agnes wasn't one you pressed. A letter," said Miss Marple softly, and set down her teacup with exactly the sound of a woman who has learned nothing at all of interest, though inwardly she had marked the fact as carefully as a jeweller marking a stone. "I don't suppose," Inspector Neal said, for he had come in quietly some minutes before and stood now by the door, notebook in hand, having been invited by Ivy with the transparent hope of hearing something useful said over her own tea things. Anyone's mentioned finding a letter of that kind among Miss Bartlett's effects. No one had. It was not, as it turned out, among her effects at all, though the second post of Monday had certainly been delivered, according to the postman, and Agnes Bartlett had certainly signed for nothing unusual, only her ordinary letters, so that whatever had troubled her, it had apparently come in an envelope indistinguishable from any other, and had since, entirely, vanished. "Perhaps it was only a bill," Prue Cardew offered, a shade too bright. "People do get so worked up over bills." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, though her tone suggested she thought it very unlikely indeed, and turned the talk, for the moment, gently elsewhere, to the weather, to the state of the harvest, to Ivy's dahlias, while continuing, beneath the pleasant surface of the conversation, to watch the room with the close, unhurried attention of a woman who had learned, over a very long life, that the truth of a gathering like this one was rarely spoken aloud at all, but showed itself instead in who fell silent, and when, and who reached rather too eagerly to fill the silence up again.
"How very odd,"
said Miss Marple to her knitting some while later, and no one in the room quite heard her say it. Chapter 3. The Wrong Glove. It was 2 days later, on the Friday, that Miss Marple made her first quiet visit to the wash-house itself, with Constable Hobbs's blushing, reluctant permission, secured by means of a plate of her own shortbread and a gentle reminder that she had, after all, known his mother. And it was there that she found the detail which would trouble her, pleasantly and persistently, for the rest of the case. The wash-house had been left more or less as the police had found it, awaiting the inquest, though the body itself was long since removed. Miss Marple stood a moment just inside the door, letting her eyes travel slowly over the room, in the manner she had long ago perfected looking without appearing to look, a manner that had served her extremely well over 4 decades of quiet village observation. The copper, the mangle, the row of irons on their shelf, graduated by size, each precisely where its neighbour would expect it, the shelf of soap and blue bag and starch, equally precise. Agnes Bartlett had been, by every account, an almost fanatically tidy woman, and the wash-house bore this out in every particular, save one. On the small deal table by the window, where Agnes evidently sorted washing before it went into the coppers, sat a single glove, a woman's glove, of good grey kid leather, rather worn at the fingertips, for the right hand only. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely looked for a long moment, and then said, to Constable Hobbs, in her mildest tone, "I don't suppose you know whose glove that is, Constable." Hobbs, who had clearly not particularly noticed the glove at all, came to look. "Couldn't say, Miss Marple. Might be Miss Bartlett's own, I suppose." "I don't think it can be," said Miss Marple. "Miss Bartlett, you see, did her washing in an apron with no gloves at all. I remember Mrs. Higgs saying as much, that Agnes's hands were quite red and rough from the lye, poor soul, which one wouldn't expect if she habitually wore gloves for the work. And in any case," she paused delicately, "this is not a glove meant for washing in. It's far too fine. It's the sort of glove a lady wears to go visiting, or to church. Someone came to call then, and left it behind." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "though it's an odd place to leave a glove, on the sorting table, right beside where the washing is done, rather than by the door where a caller would naturally have taken it off." She looked at it a moment longer. "And it's the right glove only, no left. I wonder very much, Constable, what became of the left one." Hobbs, to whom this seemed a very small point indeed to make such a fuss over, nonetheless dutifully noted it down, chiefly because Miss Marple asked him to, and because his mother had always said Miss Marple saw things other people didn't, and it seemed unwise on the whole to contradict her. He wrapped the glove carefully in a clean handkerchief and set it aside for the inspector, remarking, as he did, that his own mother does a great deal of the district's nursing still, Miss Marple, though she's retired from it properly now, only folks still send for her out of habit. Kept a pair very like it for church, though he could not imagine what that signified, and Miss Marple, hearing this small, entirely innocent remark, said nothing at all in reply, beyond a mild, "How interesting, Constable," and filed it away, as she filed away everything, without the smallest change in her expression. Miss Marple, walking home along the water meadow path a little later, turned the matter over as she might have turned over a stone to see what lived beneath it. A single glove for a caller's right hand, left not by the door but beside the sorting table, as though its owner had, for some reason, removed it there, in the middle of the room, perhaps to do something with her bare hand that gloved fingers would not have served for. Now what, Miss Marple thought, watching a heron rise heavily from the misted water, would a lady take off her right glove to do in the middle of another woman's wash-house at 6 o'clock on a foggy morning? It was not, she reflected, a question with very many comfortable answers. That same afternoon brought a small development of a rather different character, delivered to Miss Marple's own door by Ivy Trelawney, who arrived breathless and pink with the particular excitement of a woman bearing news she considers simultaneously shocking and delicious. "You'll never guess," Ivy said, settling into Miss Marple's second-best armchair without being asked, "what Inspector Neils found out about Agnes's finances. It seems she wasn't nearly as poor as everyone thought. There's over £400 in the post office savings book, if you please. £400 on a laundress's earnings. Where in the world would a woman like that come by £400? How very interesting," said Miss Marple, pouring tea for her unexpected guest. "And has anyone an idea? Gerald says," Ivy lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the room to hear. "Gerald says it looks very like she was being paid for something. Regularly, mind, not all at once. Small sums, month on month, going back years. He saw the book himself, being asked to help sort her affairs, as no relatives have come forward yet. And you know what that generally means, don't you, when a quiet, respectable, secretive sort of woman is paid small regular sums over years and years." "Blackmail," said Miss Marple, without any particular drama in her voice, as though Ivy had suggested the woman kept bees. Ivy looked faintly disappointed not to have been the one to say the word first. "Well, yes, that's rather what it looks like, doesn't it? And if Agnes Bartlett was blackmailing someone in this village, someone with money enough to pay regularly for years, well, that gives rather a different complexion to things than Sam Willett and a Sunday suit, doesn't it? Though I must say, Gerald did wonder whether it might be something quite different, an inheritance from a relation nobody knew of, or savings simply hoarded up over a whole lifetime of thrift. Laundresses are famously careful with money, after all." "They are indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though £400 is a very great deal of thrift for a woman of Agnes's modest circumstances to have achieved unaided. I think, however carefully she managed her pennies. No, I confess the regularity of the sums is what interests me most. An inheritance generally arrives all at once, my dear, not in careful monthly instalments. The trouble is," Ivy went on, "blackmail requires the blackmailer to know something, doesn't it? And I find myself wondering what in the world a laundress in a small English village could possibly have learned over the years that half a dozen respectable people would pay steadily to keep hidden." "I'm sure I don't know," said Miss Marple, though her eyes, over the rim of her own teacup, suggested she found the question every bit as interesting as Ivy did, for she had already begun, in the quiet, unhurried way she had, to suspect that the answer lay not in any single dramatic secret, but in something far more ordinary and far more damning. The accumulated, unremarkable, entirely unavoidable knowledge that comes to anyone who spends 30 years handling, folding, and returning to their owners the private linen of an entire village. A laundress sees a great deal, Ivy, that passes quite unnoticed by anyone else. Torn linings, unexpected stains, letters left by carelessness in a coat pocket sent to be pressed. Little things, most of them meaning nothing at all, but occasionally, I dare say, meaning a very great deal indeed to the person who least wishes them noticed. Miss Marple only smiled and changed the subject to the state of Ivy's dahlias, though she continued, beneath the pleasant surface of the conversation, to turn the true question over and over, the way she turned over stones, all through the rest of that long grey afternoon. Chapter 4. The Laundry Book. Inspector Neil, for his part, had reached much the same conclusion as Miss Marple, though by a rather more official route, and on the Saturday morning he called at Nethercomben's small police house to lay out, for Constable Hobbs and for Miss Marple, invited at Hobbs's rather nervous suggestion, on account of her knowing the village so well, what the county force had so far assembled. £412, 6 shillings, Neil said, tapping the savings book on the table before him. Paid irregularly but steadily, going back to 1948. Sums between £2 and £8 at a time, always in cash, always paid in by Miss Bartlett herself at the Devizes post office rather than the one here in the village. which tells us she didn't want the transactions noticed locally, whatever else it tells us. Very sensible of her, murmured Miss Marple, if she wished it kept quiet. There's more, Neil went on. She kept a book, not a diary, nothing so obliging as that. A laundry book, the ordinary sort any laundress keeps, listing whose washing came in and when and what was charged. Only this one has a good many entries that don't correspond to any actual laundry account we can trace. Little notes, initials, dates, amounts that match, near enough, the sums going into that savings book. He laid the book on the table, open to a page well toward the back, and Miss Marple leaned forward with polite interest to look. The entries were neat, in a small, careful hand. The hand, presumably, of a woman used to precision. Most of the page was ordinary enough. Trelawney, 6 shirts, 1 cloth, 3/6. Vicarage, surpluses, 2, 4 manus. But scattered among them, in the same neat hand but without any corresponding laundry item, were entries of a different character entirely. EC 2.10.0, Sept EC 2.10.0, October H 5.0.0. EC, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, and H initials, as you say. I wonder whether EC might not stand for Prudence Cardew. She signs herself Prue, but her Christian name, I believe, is Edith Prudence. And of course there's her late husband's initials too, if the entry refers to the household rather than to her alone. Neil looked at her with the particular sharp attention of a man recalculating an opinion. You know the village that well, do you? I've lived here 11 years, Inspector, which in a village of this size is not nearly long enough to know everything, but quite long enough to know a good many surnames. She studied the page a moment longer, and H. There aren't very many families in Nethercombden beginning with H. There's Mrs. Higgs at the post office, though I can't imagine what she'd have to hide that would run to £5 a month. There's old Colonel Hartnell up at the Grange. There is also, of course, Mrs. Hobbs, our good constable's mother, though I can hardly believe that such a devoted old lady could figure in anything of the kind. She paused and let the thought pass, unremarked, as though it had cost her nothing at all to raise it. And there's the Willets, of course, though their name begins with W, not H, unless it refers to something else. A place, perhaps, rather than a person. We'll want that laundry book gone through most carefully, Neil said, half to himself. Every entry, matched against every family in this village, going back 6 years. It's slow work, but it's the sort of work that generally pays. May I ask, Inspector, Miss Marple said, with the particular deference she employed when she intended to say something rather more pointed than the tone suggested, whether the entries stop at any point, whether there's a gap, for instance, or whether the last entry before her death tells us anything. Neil turned to the final written page. The last entry, dated the previous Friday, 3 days, that was, before the murder, read simply EC 210.0, refused. The word sat there, underlined once, in the same careful hand. Refused, Neil read aloud. Meaning what, precisely? That the payment was refused, or that Agnes Bartlett refused to accept it? Or, said Miss Marple, very quietly, that whoever EC is, they refused, for the first time in perhaps 6 years, to pay. And I think, Inspector, that if a person has been paying quietly for years to keep some ugly small fact buried and then abruptly stops paying, it is worth asking very carefully what changed, because either they had decided they no longer cared whether the secret came out, she paused, or they had decided upon a rather more permanent way of ensuring it never would. The room was quiet for a moment. Even Constable Hobbs, who had said very little through the whole interview, looked faintly troubled by the shape the conversation had taken. And the letter, Neil said slowly, the one that came Monday morning, that Miss Colley mentioned. If it arrived Monday, and the refusal is dated the previous Friday, then whatever the letter contained, Miss Marple finished for him, it came after the refusal, not before it. Which suggests to me, Inspector, that it was not Agnes threatening to expose someone at all. I began to wonder whether it was quite the other way around. It took Sergeant Willoughby, working with grim patience through parish records, rate books, and the memories of half the older residents of Nethercumden, the better part of 2 days to run the laundry book's initials to ground, and what he produced, by Sunday evening, surprised Inspector Neil rather less than it surprised the village at large. Once, inevitably, word of it began, in fragments, to leak. EC was, indeed, Edith Prudence Cardew of the circulating library, the very woman who had been so eager, on the Wednesday, to point Miss Marple's attention towards Sam Willett and his Sunday suit, and who had, Miss Marple now recalled with fresh interest, let slip her own small confession of a quarrel with Agnes over nothing more than a library book, returned a day late. H. proved rather more startling, not Colonel Hartnell, nor Mrs. Higgs, but Nora Willett, whose maiden name, it emerged from the parish register, had been Hartley, and who had, evidently, continued for some years after her marriage to be recorded in Agnes Bartlett's private book under her old girlhood initial, as though the debt, whatever it was, belonged to Nora Hartley rather than to Nora Willett, and had never quite been transferred, in Agnes's own private accounting, to the woman she'd since become, which is interesting in itself, Miss Marple observed, when Neil brought her these findings the following morning, more out of the habit that had grown up between them over the past week than out of any official obligation. It suggests whatever Agnes knew about Nora Willett, she had known it since before Nora was married, which would put it back a good 20 years or more, long before the laundry book itself begins. Which means the payments only started later, Neil said. Something happened, 6 years back, to make Agnes decide to start collecting on a secret she'd apparently sat on for 20 years without a word. Yes, said Miss Marple, and I think, Inspector, that is very much the question we ought to be asking. Not only what the secrets were, though I confess I have begun to form 1 or 2 small guesses on that score, but why a woman who had kept silent, apparently without profiting by it, for 20 years, should suddenly decide, 6 years ago, to begin asking to be paid. She looked out of her cottage window to where the last of the morning mist still clung to the water meadow, soft and grey and entirely undramatic, and added, almost to herself, something must have changed for Agnes herself, I think, quite as much as for the people she knew things about. People do not generally alter their whole manner of living without a reason, and I have a small suspicion, though it is no more than that yet, as to what that reason might have been. Chapter 5. The reluctant librarian Miss Marple, being a methodical woman, did not neglect Prue Cardew simply because a more startling name had since presented itself, and on the Monday afternoon she called at the little circulating library with a novel to return, and, as it happened, a good many questions she had no intention of asking directly. She found Mrs. Cardew behind her small counter, stamping cards with rather more force than the task required, and looking, Miss Marple thought, considerably less at ease than a woman merely troubled by the general horror of a neighbour's murder ought to look. "I hope you'll forgive my asking, my dear," Miss Marple said, once the pleasantries of the returned novel had been exhausted, "but I understand the police have found your own initials, as it were, among poor Agnes's private accounts. I do hope it hasn't caused you too much distress." Prue Cardew's hands still went on the stamping pad. For a moment she said nothing at all, and when she did speak, her voice had lost its usual brisk, managing certainty. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "I think you do, my dear," Miss Marple said, not unkindly, "and I think, whatever it is, you would very much rather tell it to me, quietly, over a cup of tea, than have Inspector Neil drag it out of you in front of the whole village at some later date, which he assuredly will, sooner or later, once the accounts are fully traced." Mrs. Cardew's composure, so carefully maintained through a week of village gossip, gave way all at once, and she sat down rather suddenly on the small stool behind her counter, her hands pressed to her face. "It was my late husband," she said, muffled. "Harold, he took money, Miss Marple, from the church roof fund, 6 years back, when he had charge of it as churchwarden. Not a great deal, perhaps £30 in all, but he was desperate, We'd debts I never knew of until after, and he meant to put it back before anyone noticed. Only he never had the chance, for he died that very winter, sudden, his heart, before he could set it right. She looked up, eyes wet. Agnes did the vicarage laundry, you understand, and somehow, I never knew how, precisely, she came to learn of it. Perhaps she saw the ledger left open when she delivered the surplices. I don't know. She never said. She only came to me, very quiet, very kind about it in her way, and said she'd not tell the vicar, or a living soul, if only I'd make good the debt myself, a little at a time. So the fund was whole again, and no shame fell on Harold's memory. I've been paying it back through her, £2.10 at a time, every month for 6 years, and glad enough to do it, for it kept his name clean, and mine besides. And the entry marked refused, Miss Marple said gently. That was a fortnight ago. Because it was paid back, Mrs. Cardew said, with sudden fierce relief in her voice, as though grateful at last to say it aloud. Paid back in full, Miss Marple, every penny of it, that very week. I told her I'd no need to pay any more, and she agreed, quite readily, that the debt was settled. There was nothing sinister in it at all, whatever that word in her book might suggest to a stranger's eye. I dare say she wrote it, just as she meant it, that I'd refuse to pay again, because there was nothing left owing. Miss Marple sat with this a long moment, feeling the small, satisfying click of a piece falling cleanly out of the puzzle rather than into it. For whatever else the refused entry might mean, it plainly did not mean what she and Neil had first, rather darkly, supposed. "Thank you, my dear, for telling me," she said at last. "I don't think this need go any further than the inspector's own file, and I very much doubt it bears on Agnes's death at all. But I am glad to understand it, and gladder still, I think, that you have carried such a heavy, small secret so honourably all these years." She left the library a little while later, her novel exchanged for another, and walked home reflecting that the case had lost one suspect and one small mystery both in the same quarter of an hour, and yet had gained, in its place, a clearer sense of exactly the kind of woman Agnes Bartlett had truly been. Not a blackmailer in the ordinary, grasping sense at all, but something a good deal stranger and more particular, a woman who used the secrets that came into her hands, not for her own comfort, but, it seemed, for purposes she alone understood and had shared with no one, which makes the entry marked H all the more troubling, Miss Marple thought, turning up her own garden path. For if Prue Cardew's debt was an honest one, repaid and rightly closed, what, I wonder, was Nora Willett's, that it has never yet been closed at all? Chapter 6. Nora Willett's silence. Nora Willett had said almost nothing at Ivy Trelawney's tea party the week before, and Miss Marple, who had marked the omission at the time, thought it high time someone remedied it, though she went about the remedy with her customary indirection, calling at the Willett farmhouse the following afternoon on the pretext of asking after a recipe for damson cheese that Nora was known to make particularly well. She found Nora alone in her kitchen, sleeves rolled to the elbow, working a great copper pan of fruit with a wooden spoon, and got her damson recipe within the first 5 minutes, faithfully copied into the small notebook Miss Marple carried for such purposes. It was only afterward, over the tea Nora rather stiffly offered, that the conversation turned, by the gentlest of degrees, toward Agnes Bartlett. "A dreadful business," Miss Marple said, watching Nora's face rather than her own teacup. "And I understand the police have found some rather curious entries in poor Miss Bartlett's account books. Initials, apparently, rather than proper names, I suppose to keep her regular customers private, laundresses being such discreet people as a rule." Nora's hand, stirring nothing at all now, went very still on the table. "I don't know anything about her account books," she said. "No, of course not, my dear. Why should you?" Miss Marple let a small silence sit between them, the sort of silence that, in her long experience, people found very much harder to bear than any direct question. "It's only that one of the initials was H, and I did wonder, quite idly, you understand, whether it mightn't refer to your own maiden name. Hartley, wasn't it?" The colour left Nora Willett's face so completely and so suddenly that Miss Marple felt a small pang of genuine regret for having caused it. though not enough to withdraw the observation. "I was a girl of 19, Nora said at last, in a voice gone flat and low. 19, Miss Marple, and I did something foolish and wicked that I've paid for every single day since, in my own conscience if nowhere else. And I'll thank you not to ask me what it was, because I've never told a living soul in 30 years, and I don't intend to start now, not even to save my own neck, if it comes to that." "I would never ask you to confess anything you didn't wish to," Miss Marple said gently. "I only want to know, Nora, whether you paid Agnes Bartlett money to keep silent about it, and whether, on the morning she died, you were anywhere near her wash-house." "I paid her," Nora said, very low. "God forgive me, I paid her, because I was afraid, and because whatever I'd done, I couldn't bear for Sam and his father to know of it after all these years. But I never went near her that Tuesday morning. I was here, in this kitchen, with the bread, proving, same as every Tuesday of my life, and my husband will tell you the same, for he was in and out all morning mending the gate. And Sam himself was over at the home farm from 6, helping with the milking. You may ask any of the men there, they'll tell you the same." A flicker of something bitter crossed her face. "I know the whole village thinks it was Sam, over that wretched suit. He's got his father's quick tongue, that's all it is, and never a bit of harm in him beyond it. It's a cruel thing, Miss Marple, to have your own son bandied about the shops for murder, over words spoken hot and forgotten 5 minutes after." "I believe you, my dear," Miss Marple said, and meant it, not with certainty, for certainty was a luxury she rarely permitted herself this early in an investigation, but with the particular instinct, honed over decades, that told her when a person's shame was genuine and when it was merely convenient. Nora Willett's secret, whatever its precise shape, belonged to the ordinary sad catalogue of youthful mistakes that every village accumulated and mostly forgave, in time, if given the chance, not to the colder, more deliberate business of murder. "I believe you," she said again, and turned the conversation back, with real kindness, to damson cheese, leaving Nora Willett to her fruit and her 30-year-old grief, and carrying away with her only the confirmation of what she had already half suspected, that Nora's secret, whatever it was, ran parallel to the case, and not through its heart, though she noted, before she left, that Nora's eyes had strayed, more than once during their talk, toward the small photograph on the dresser of Sam as a boy, and thought that whatever the old sin had been, its weight had never once, in 30 years, grown any lighter for the carrying. Inspector Neal, meeting Miss Marple by the church lich gate that same evening on his way back from questioning the men at the home farm, who had, indeed, confirmed Sam Willett's presence at the milking from 6 o'clock sharp, thoroughly and independently, to Neal's considerable relief, allowed himself a rare moment of frustration. 2 suspects cleared in as many days, he said, and not a single one any nearer the truth. Prue Cardew's debt was honest and settled. Nora Willett has an alibi thick enough to hang a coat on. Sam Willett's clear as day. I begin to wonder, Miss Marple, whether that laundry book is going to lead us anywhere at all, or whether we're not simply cataloguing the private griefs of half this village to no purpose whatsoever. I shouldn't be discouraged, Inspector, Miss Marple said placidly. In my experience, the clearing away of the wrong answers is every bit as necessary as the finding of the right one. Indeed, I sometimes think it more so, for it is only once the easy, comfortable explanations have all been shown false that people are willing to look, really look, at the one explanation nobody wished to consider in the first place. She paused by the gate, looking back toward the churchyard, where the evening light lay gold and quiet across the older graves. I begin to think, myself, that we have not yet asked the right question at all. We have been asking who Agnes Bartlett knew things about. I wondered whether we ought instead to be asking what Agnes Bartlett herself once lost, for I have a growing suspicion, Inspector, that the heart of this matter lies not in blackmail for its own sake, but in something a great deal older and a great deal sadder than mere greed. Chapter 7. The Sister Who Died. The reason, when Miss Marple finally ran it to ground, not through any dramatic discovery, but through the patient, unglamorous business of taking tea with 3 separate elderly residents of Nether Comden over the course of a single afternoon, turned out to concern a woman almost nobody in the present village remembered clearly at all, Agnes Bartlett's younger sister, Winifred. It was old Mrs. Peck, who had lived in Nether Comden the whole of her 81 years, and whose memory for the distant past was very much sharper than her memory for what she had eaten at breakfast, who supplied the fullest account, delivered over a pot of very strong tea in her cottage by the church. Winnie Bartlett, Mrs. Peck said, nodding slowly. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken in donkey's years. Agnes's young sister, 5 years the junior, and pretty as a picture, where Agnes was always the plain, sensible one. That was always the way of it with those two. Winnie went into service, up at the Grange, when the old colonel's father had it. Must be, 26, 27 years back now. And what became of her? Miss Marple asked, though she had already begun to suspect the shape of the answer. Trouble, said Mrs. Peck, with the flat finality of a woman who had seen the pattern before and would see it again. The old story, my dear, though nobody speaks of such things so plain nowadays. Winnie got herself into trouble up at the Grange, and no ring on her finger to show for it, and the family that ought to have stood behind her didn't, not a penny nor a kind word, and she went off to have the child somewhere private, the way girls did in those days, and never rightly came back to herself after. Died not 2 years later. Consumption, they said, though I always thought it more a matter of a broken heart than a weak chest, if you want my honest opinion. Agnes never spoke of it, not once, not to my knowledge, in 30 years. But I don't imagine a woman forgets a thing like that, do you, whatever face she puts on for the neighbours. And the child? Miss Marple asked, very gently. There now, said Mrs. Peck, that I couldn't tell you. Given away, I always heard, to some family quiet, the way such things were managed. Nobody in the village ever saw hide nor hair of it after Winnie went off. It might have died along with her mother, for all anyone here ever knew, or it might be walking about somewhere this very day, 40-odd years old, not knowing the first thing about where it came from. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, her tea cooling untouched in her hand, turning this new fact over with the particular care she gave to anything that touched on old grief, old shame, and the long, quiet cruelties that villages of a certain generation had so often visited upon young women who could least afford them. Mrs. Peck, she said at last, who, precisely, was the father? Do you know? Mrs. Peck's face closed very slightly. The particular closing of a face that has decided a thing is either too dangerous or too uncertain to say aloud, even after 30 years. There was talk, she said carefully. There's always talk in a place this size. But talk's not knowing, my dear, and I'll not put a name to a man on the strength of talk alone, not when half the folk it might touch are still living and walking about this village to this very day. She looked at Miss Marple with a shrewdness that belied her age. But I'll say this much. Since you've a way of getting things out of a person without hardly trying, whoever he was somebody with money enough that Winnie's family, meaning Agnes, for their parents were long dead by then, might have made things very awkward indeed if she'd chosen to. And Agnes never did choose to. Not for 20 years and more. Until, said Miss Marple softly, 6 years ago. Until then, seemingly, Mrs. Peck agreed, though she did not ask how Miss Marple came to know the timing so precisely, being far too well-mannered, or far too curious to risk being told to mind her own affairs, to press the point. Later that same afternoon, over a second, weaker pot of tea at the vicarage, the Reverend Pym confirmed what he could of the sad story from the parish registers, though his own memory of the events themselves was hazy, he having come to the living only some 15 years before. There is a grave, he admitted, toward the north wall, that I have always understood to be hers, though I confess I never knew the particulars, and it seemed unkind to ask. Agnes attended it faithfully, every week of my incumbency, though she never once spoke to me of the sister buried there, beyond the plainest civilities. And old Mr. Dunning, the retired schoolmaster, contributed only the melancholy detail that he had taught both sisters as girls, and that Winifred had been, in his memory, a laughing, careless sort of child, the kind the whole village petted. And it went very hard with all of us, I think, to hear how she ended. Miss Marple walked home slowly in the fading afternoon light, past the churchyard where, she now recalled, there was indeed a small, plain headstone toward the northern wall, half overgrown with ivy, that she had noticed once or twice without particular attention. Winifred Mary Bartlett, 1907 to 1935, sister, beloved, and not forgotten. Not forgotten, Miss Marple thought, standing before it a moment in the thin gold light. No, I don't imagine she was forgotten at all. I imagine Agnes Bartlett thought of her sister every single day of her life, and folded other people's linen, and kept her own counsel, and grew old alone with a cat for company. And then, 6 years ago, something happened that made silence no longer bearable to her. Something that made her decide, after 20 years, that the man who had ruined her sister and let her die unclaimed ought, at the very least, to pay for it. Not out of greed, I think, but out of something far closer to justice, however crookedly she went about seeking it. She thought of the laundry book's careful entries, E.C.H., and wondered which of them, if either, connected to that old and buried grief, or whether there might yet be others in that book whose secrets ran deeper still, and older, and closer to the heart of what had happened in the wash-house on a foggy Tuesday morning. She thought, too, of the single grey glove upon the sorting table, and of a letter that had arrived on Monday and vanished by Tuesday, and of the word refused underlined once in a dead woman's careful hand, now satisfactorily explained and set aside, and by the time she reached her own garden gate, she had begun to form, though she would not yet have called it a certainty, a small, cold, and rather dreadful suspicion as to what precisely had changed 6 years before to turn Agnes Bartlett from a woman who kept silence into a woman who kept a book. Chapter 8. Colonel Hartnell remembers. It was Inspector Neal, working from an entirely different angle, who brought the investigation its next significant turn, and he brought it, rather to his own surprise, straight to Miss Marple's cottage door on the Monday evening, a full week after the murder, with the slightly harassed look of a man whose case has just become considerably more complicated than it was that morning. "Colonel Hartnell," he said, settling into the chair Miss Marple offered him, and accepting, gratefully, a cup of tea, "has just told me something rather interesting about the late Reginald Ashworth." "Ashworth?" Miss Marple repeated. "I don't believe I know the name." "No reason you should. He died some 3 years back, and before that he'd not lived in the district for over a decade. A wealthy man, retired from business in Bristol, bought Comden House out past the mill, and lived there very quietly with a housekeeper and precious little company. Colonel Hartnell knew him a little through the Bowls Club, and it seems Ashworth once let slip, over rather too much whisky one evening some years ago, that he'd made a mistake in his young days that had cost him dear ever since, his words, according to the Colonel, and that he'd been paying for it steady, and would go on paying for it till he died, and it served him right." Miss Marple set down her own teacup with great care. "And when precisely did Mr. Ashworth die, Inspector?" 3 years ago this coming spring. Heart, apparently. Quite sudden. The Colonel says he'd grown melancholy in his last year or two, kept much to himself, wouldn't say why. There was some talk at the time that he'd changed his will not long before he died, though the Colonel couldn't say in whose favour. "That, I think, we might be able to discover," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "if Mr. Trelawney's firm handled the matter, or knows who did. It would be interesting to learn whether Reginald Ashworth left any legacy, however small, to a person nobody in this village has ever heard of." "I'll have Gerald Trelawney looked into," Neal said, making a note. "Though it's a fair guess, isn't it, given what you've already told me of Winifred Bartlett, where that legacy might have gone, or been meant to go, if the poor girl he ruined had lived to claim it." "Yes," said Miss Marple slowly, "and I think, Inspector, that if Ashworth was the H in Agnes's book, for the sums recorded under H, do stop, I think you said, some 3 years back, do they not? Then whatever debt he was paying, whatever secret Agnes held over him, ended not because he refused to pay, as we first feared with poor Mrs. Cardew, but simply because he died and could pay no more. That's how it looks, Neil agreed, which lets Ashworth out as a suspect, obviously enough, being 3 years dead himself. But it does rather confirm the general shape of things, doesn't it? A man who admits, in his cups, to some old sin he's paying for. A laundress with a dead sister who never married. It's not very difficult to guess what connected them, if you'll forgive my putting it so plainly in your drawing room, Miss Marple. You needn't apologize for plain speaking, Inspector, Miss Marple said. I have found, over a long life, that plain speaking is generally a good deal kinder, in the end, than the alternative. But I think you are quite right. I believe Reginald Ashworth was very probably the man responsible for what happened to Winifred Bartlett 30 years ago, and I think Agnes knew it, or came to know it, and said nothing at all until 6 years back. Which brings us straight to the question I still can't answer, said Neil, with some frustration. Why 6 years back? What changed? Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her needles moving slowly, though her eyes were fixed on something well beyond the wool in her lap. Inspector, she said at last, I wonder whether you have considered the possibility that it was not something that changed about Reginald Ashworth at all, his circumstances, his conscience, anything of that kind, but something that changed about the child. Neil looked up sharply. You said to yourself that the child was given away, that no one in the village ever knew what became of it. But children grow up, Inspector. A child given away in 1935 would, 6 years ago, have been very nearly 30 years of age, old enough, perhaps, to come looking for the mother it never knew, or the family it never had, old enough to write a letter, or pay a visit, or simply appear one day in a village its own mother had left in disgrace 3 decades before. Her needles stopped entirely. I think it very possible indeed that 6 years ago Agnes Bartlett's sister's child came home to Nethercomben, and that Agnes, seeing that child, perhaps for the very first time in her life, decided she could no longer let the man who had ruined that child's mother go entirely unpunished. I think she may have begun asking for money, not for herself at all, Inspector, but for that child, whoever and wherever that child now is. The silence that followed this was a long one, broken only by the small settling of the fire, and Inspector Neil, looking at the small, mild, elderly woman across from him, felt, not for the first time in the course of his career, but perhaps more strongly than usual, the particular, faintly unnerving sensation of watching an entire case reorganize itself around a single quiet observation. If you're right, he said slowly, then, somewhere in this village, or near it, there may be a person nobody has thought to look at closely at all, a stranger, or someone who arrived some years back and was simply absorbed into village life without anyone asking too many questions about where they'd come from. Yes, said Miss Marple, I think that is very likely indeed, and I think, Inspector, if I were you, I should ask rather carefully who, in the last 6 or 7 years, has come to live in or near Nethercomben, and whether any of them arrived with a story about their origins that nobody has ever quite troubled to check. She resumed her knitting and added, almost as an afterthought, in the mild tone she reserved for her most pointed observations, I confess I have one name already in mind, Inspector, though I should very much rather be wrong about it than right. Chapter 9. The Break-In. It was 2 days later, on Thursday, that Nethercomben received its second shock of the affair. Not a death this time, but something that ran through the village with nearly the same electric speed. Dinah Colley's cottage, a small rented place at the far end of the lane past the church, had been broken into in the night. Nothing of value was taken. Dinah had little enough to take in any case, but her small writing desk had been thoroughly turned out, papers scattered across the floor, and a tin box, in which she kept what she called her bits of family paper, had been forced open and left empty. There wasn't much in it, Dinah told Inspector Neil, white-faced and shaking, when he came to see her that morning. Only my own birth certificate, and a letter my adoptive mother left me, and a photograph or two. But it's all gone, Inspector, every scrap of it. Someone's taken the only proof I ever had of who I really am. It was Miss Marple, arriving not an hour later with a small basket of eggs by way of comfort and pretext, who drew out, over a cup of strong sweet tea forced upon the badly shaken woman, the fuller story that Dinah had not yet told the police at all. "I came to Nether Comden 6 years ago," Dinah admitted, twisting her handkerchief in her lap, "because I'd learned from my adoptive mother's papers after she died that I'd been born not far from here and that my real mother's name had been Winifred Bartlett. I never meant to make trouble for anyone. I only wanted to know where I came from. Everyone wants that, don't they, in the end? I found out Winifred had a sister still living here, and I came and I watched her, from a distance, for weeks before I ever worked up the courage to speak to her at all." "And when did you speak to her?" Dinah's eyes filled. "She wept, Miss Marple, right there in her own doorway, the first time I told her who I was. This stiff, quiet, buttoned-up little woman, weeping like her heart would break, and holding my hands so tight it hurt. She said she'd prayed for 30 years that someone would come and tell her Winnie's baby had lived. She never once made me feel unwelcome. She gave me work arranging the church flowers, introduced me to the village as an old friend, and never once let on to a soul what I really was to her. She said it was better that way, safer for me, she said, though I never quite understood what she meant by that until now." "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "she meant that there was a man still living, or lately dead, whose family might not have welcomed the knowledge that Winifred Bartlett's daughter had a claim, moral, if not legal, upon them. And I think, my dear, that Agnes decided, very quietly, over the 6 years since you came to her, to see that claim honoured, whether that family liked it or not." "You mean the money," Dinah said slowly. "The money the police keep asking me about. I never touched a penny of it, Miss Marple, I swear to you. I never even knew there was money, not till the inspector told me of that savings book." "No," said Miss Marple, "I don't believe you did. I think Agnes meant to give it to you altogether. In the end, once she had gathered what she felt was owed, perhaps she meant it as a wedding gift, or a nest egg, something given all at once rather than in dribs and drabs that might have raised awkward questions before she was ready. But I think, my dear, that the letter which came for her the Monday before she died had something to do with you and with the proof of your parentage. And I think whoever broke into your cottage last night was looking for the very papers that would establish, beyond any doubt, exactly who your father was. But who would care so much after all this time?" Dinah's voice cracked. "Reginald Ashworth's been dead 3 years. What does it matter to anyone now?" Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment, with an expression of such genuine sorrow that Dinah, despite everything, felt oddly comforted by it. "It matters very much, I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "to whoever helped arrange, 30 years ago, that you should be given away and that Winifred should be told, or allowed to believe, that her child had died. Because if you can prove who you are, my dear, you prove that a lie was told, a deliberate, carefully managed lie, and there is very often someone still living who arranged such lies, and who stands to lose a great deal more than money if the arranging of it ever comes properly to light." She rose to go, gathering her empty egg basket, and paused for a moment at Dinah's door. "Tell me, my dear, who else in the village knew of your true parentage? Beyond Agnes herself, I mean." "No one," Dinah said. "I'm certain of it. Agnes was most particular about that. She said it was for no one else to know until she was ready to prove it properly. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, half to herself, "someone knew enough to come here in the dead of night and know precisely what to look for and precisely where a tin box of family papers was likely to be kept. That is a very great deal of particular knowledge, my dear, for a person who was never supposed to know anything at all." Inspector Neal, examining the scene later that morning, found the break-in a good deal more troubling for what it did not show than for what it did. The window latch at the back of the cottage had been forced, cleanly and without excessive noise, by someone who plainly knew how such a latch might be sprung with a thin blade. Not the work, he thought, of an opportunist tramp, whatever Colonel Hartnell and half the village still preferred to believe, but of someone with a very particular object in mind, who had known exactly what they were looking for and very possibly exactly where to find it, "Whoever did this," he said to Miss Marple, standing in the small disordered front room, "knew the shape of the tin box well enough to force the lid rather than smash the thing to pieces looking for it. That argues someone who'd either seen it before or been told a great deal about it by someone who had." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think that is very much the crux of the matter, Inspector. Agnes Bartlett trusted very few people with the truth of Dinah's birth, but I do not think, now, that she trusted no one at all besides Dinah herself. I think there was one other person, someone Agnes had known and, in her own quiet way, relied upon for many years, in whom she may, at some point, have confided at least a part of the truth, whether from need or from simple human loneliness. And I think, Inspector, we should ask ourselves very carefully who that person might have been." Chapter 10. An Old Nurse's Roses. It was that same afternoon, walking home along the churchyard path in a thoughtful frame of mind, that Miss Marple encountered, entirely by chance, an old acquaintance she had somehow, she reflected afterward, with a faint private irritation at her own oversight, allowed to slip almost entirely from her notice throughout the whole of the investigation. Mrs. Hobbs, not the young constable's wife, for he had none, but his mother, old Mrs. Winifred Hobbs, a small, stooped, soft-spoken woman of perhaps 70, who had, for as long as Miss Marple had lived in Nethercumden, tended the churchyard roses with a devotion that bordered on the religious, was on her knees among the graves near the northern wall, secateurs in hand, working with quiet, patient absorption at the ivy that had overgrown a small plain headstone. Miss Marple stopped and looked, and felt something shift very quietly into place, the way the final piece of a puzzle sometimes does, not with any dramatic click, but with a small, almost apologetic settling, as though it had been waiting patiently all along to be noticed. The headstone Mrs. Hobbs was clearing was Winifred Bartlett's own. "How very kind of you, Mrs. Hobbs," Miss Marple said, coming to stand beside her. "I don't believe I've ever seen this grave so well tended. Did you know Miss Winifred Bartlett then? I hadn't realized." Mrs. Hobbs looked up, and for just a moment, no more than a moment, quickly mastered, something moved behind her mild, faded eyes that Miss Marple recognized very well from long acquaintance with fear in all its village disguises. "I did the district nursing hereabouts in those days, Miss Marple," she said, returning to her ivy with rather more concentration than the task strictly required. "Before your time, of course. I brought a good many of this village into the world, and saw a good many out of it besides. Winnie Bartlett was one I was fond of, a sweet, foolish girl, ruined by a man who ought to have known better, and I've kept her grave tidy these 30 years because nobody else troubled her, once Agnes got old and her own hands too stiff for kneeling work." "How very good of you," Miss Marple said again, gently, watching the old woman's hands, which were not, she noticed, entirely steady. "I wonder, Mrs. Hobbs, since you knew Winifred so well, and attended her, I suppose, at the birth, whether you ever learned what became of the child. There has been a great deal of talk, you know, since poor Agnes died, about a child given away all those years ago." Mrs. Hobbs's creatures stopped, quite still, among the ivy leaves. "The child died," she said, without looking up. "Same week as it was born, a weak, sickly little thing, born too soon. I signed the certificate myself. There's no mystery in it at all, whatever the village is saying." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "how very sad. And yet I understand there is a young woman presently living in this very village, Miss Dinah Colley, who does the church flowers, as it happens, quite as devotedly as you tend these graves, who has papers, or had them until last night, suggesting she is that very child, alive and grown, and come home at last to find her mother's family." Mrs. Hobbs did not answer at once. When she did, her voice had gone very quiet and very careful, in a way that struck Miss Marple, listening closely, as more frightened than merely surprised. "Papers can say a great many things, Miss Marple," she said at last, gathering her clippings with hands that shook only very slightly. "It doesn't make them true." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "though I have always found, Mrs. Hobbs, that when a truth has been buried a very long while, it very often takes exactly this shape when it is at last disturbed. Papers going missing, certificates that don't quite agree with one another, an old woman's memory proving oddly precise on one small point and strangely vague on every other. I wonder whether you have heard, by the way, that Miss Colley's cottage was broken into last night, and every scrap of paper touching on her parentage was taken away. Something in Mrs. Hobbs's face went very still and very old all at once. I hadn't heard, she said, and rose, with the stiff care of an old woman's knees, gathered her basket of cuttings, and went away down the churchyard path toward the lich gate without another word, and Miss Marple stood a long while by Winifred Bartlett's cleared and tended grave, watching her go, turning over in her mind a small, cold, and now nearly complete certainty that she found she took no pleasure whatsoever in having reached. Chapter 11. What the Records Office confirmed Inspector Neil, when Miss Marple laid this small scene before him that same evening, over a rather more serious pot of tea than their earlier meetings had required, listened with the particular stillness of a man who had just been handed the missing corner of a very difficult puzzle. Mrs. Hobbs, he said slowly, Constable Hobbs's own mother. Good God! I don't say it is certain, Inspector, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she believed it very nearly was. But I think you would find it worth your while to write to the General Register Office and ask them to send you a certified copy of the birth and the death, if one was ever registered, of Winifred Bartlett's child, born, I believe, sometime in the early months of 1935. I think you may find some curious discrepancies. If the certificate Dinah Colley carried in her tin box was genuine, and the death certificate Mrs. Hobbs speaks of quite so confidently also exists. I'll wire London first thing, Neil said, though these things take days even at their fastest, and I confess I'd rather have something more immediate to go on. What of the glove, Miss Marple? Have you learned anything more that might tell us whether it belongs to her? Only that Constable Hobbs himself told me, quite innocently, that his mother keeps a pair very like it for church, Miss Marple said, which is not proof, Inspector, I grant you. Half the older ladies in this village own a pair of grey kid gloves very like it, myself included, but it is one more small thread pulling in the same direction as everything else, and I have learned, over a great many years, that when enough small threads all pull the same way, it is generally unwise to go on pretending they point nowhere in particular. It took 4 days in which Nether Comden, growing restless under the strain of unresolved horror, produced still further theories, each wilder than the last, and in which Dinah Colley, badly shaken, was persuaded by Ivy Trelawney to stay at the Trelawney house rather than alone in her broken cottage, before Neil's inquiry to London bore fruit, and what it produced, when it came, confirmed very nearly everything Miss Marple had begun quietly to suspect. 2 birth certificates existed for the child born to Winifred Mary Bartlett in February of 1935. The first, registered promptly, recorded the birth of a daughter, informant given as W. Hobbs, midwife present at birth, the very document, presumably, that Dinah Colley's adoptive family had carried away with the child, and that had lain in a tin box until 3 nights ago. The second, registered some 6 weeks later, in a different district entirely, recorded the death of an unnamed female infant, cause given as prematurity and failure to thrive, signed, once again, by the same midwife, W. Hobbs. 2 certificates, Neil said grimly, laying them side by side on Miss Marple's own small table. One for a living child, quietly given away to a family who'd pay well and ask no questions. One for a dead child, to satisfy the mother and anyone else who might come asking that there was nothing left to find. She falsified the second one entirely. There's no infant death in that parish register at all to correspond with it. We've checked most carefully. And I think, Miss Marple said quietly, that Reginald Ashworth's family paid Mrs. Hobbs very well indeed, 30 years ago, to arrange the whole sad business so tidily, to see the child placed quietly with a respectable family at a comfortable distance, and to see Winifred and her sister told and believing that the baby had died, so that no claim of any kind could ever trouble the Ashworth name. I imagine it seemed at the time a kindness almost, sparing Winifred the further pain of raising a child alone in disgrace. But it was built upon a lie, Inspector, a deliberate and carefully managed lie, and old Mrs. Hobbs has carried the guilt and the profit of it, I think, for 30 years, profiting, I imagine, rather more steadily and rather more quietly than anyone in this village ever thought to suspect of so mild and devoted an old woman. And when Agnes found out, Neil began, when Agnes found out 6 years ago that Dinah Colley was alive after all, Miss Marple finished, I believe she went, very naturally, to the one person who could confirm it beyond any doubt, the midwife who had attended the birth. And I think Mrs. Hobbs, faced with exposure of a fraud she had practiced and profited by for 30 years, persuaded Agnes to say nothing to the child at once, to let matters lie quiet a little longer, and perhaps offered herself to make some small contribution toward Agnes's collection on Dinah's behalf, to keep Agnes's goodwill and her silence both. It would explain, I think, why the sums recorded do not all come from a single source. Some, I now believe, came from Reginald Ashworth himself in guilty conscience, and some, perhaps, came from Mrs. Hobbs, not out of guilt for Winifred's ruin, which was never truly her doing, but out of guilt and fear for the fraud she herself committed upon that poor dead girl's grief. And the letter that came the Monday before Agnes died? I think, Miss Marple said, very gravely now, that the letter came from the General Register Office itself, or from some solicitor acting on Dinah's behalf, confirming precisely what your own inquiry has just confirmed to you, that 2 certificates exist, and that the second is a fraud. I think Agnes read that letter, and understood at last the full and dreadful truth of what had been done, not only to her sister, but to the child she had grown to love in the 6 years since Dinah first came to her door. And I think, Inspector, that on the Tuesday morning, before her ordinary work began, Agnes intended to confront Mrs. Hobbs directly, to tell her, gently perhaps, for Agnes was not by nature a vindictive woman, that the truth could no longer be kept from Dinah, whatever it cost the old nurse's reputation and her son's position both. Chapter 12. The Glove Explained. It was the following morning, a Sunday, with the church bells ringing thin and clear across the water meadow, that Miss Marple returned once more to the single question that had nagged at her since her very first visit to the wash-house. The grey kid glove, right hand only, lying not by the door but upon the sorting table itself. She found Inspector Neil at the police house, going through, for perhaps the 20th time, the small collection of physical evidence gathered from the scene, and she asked him, with her customary mildness, whether he might once more show her the glove. He did. She turned it over in her own gloved hands, for she had, this Sunday morning, worn her second best pair, grey kid, rather worn at the fingertips, and Neil, watching her, saw with a small start precisely why she had chosen them. "You believe it's Mrs. Hobbs's glove?" he said. "I believe it very probably is," said Miss Marple. "Consider, Inspector, why a lady calling early on a foggy morning might remove one glove, and one glove only, in the middle of a wash-house, rather than by the door as any ordinary caller would. I think Mrs. Hobbs came to Agnes's wash-house that Tuesday morning at Agnes's own invitation, or perhaps uninvited, having somehow learned, from Agnes herself, or guessed from her manner, that the truth was about to come out. I think there were words between them, standing there among the wet linen, and I think that at some point in that conversation, Mrs. Hobbs, a district nurse of 40 years' experience, Inspector, a woman entirely practiced in matters of the body, in holding a patient still, in knowing precisely how long a person must be held to lose consciousness, and how much longer again to ensure they never wake, removed her right glove, because a bare hand serves such a purpose very much better than a gloved one, and because she needed, I think, the full and precise sensitivity of her fingers for what she had already decided to do. The room was very quiet. She'd have known exactly how, Neil said slowly. A nurse, God help us. Of course she'd have known exactly how, and exactly how long, and precisely where to press to leave the fewest marks. I think, Miss Marple went on, that in the struggle, brief as it must have been, for Agnes was not a young woman, and would not have fought long, the left glove was lost somewhere, perhaps dropped and later recovered, without her noticing its fellow had gone, or perhaps simply fallen where it could not easily be seen in the poor light of that foggy morning. I found, on my very first visit to that garden, a single wooden clothes peg lying in the mud some distance from the washing lines, dropped, I think, by someone leaving in haste, in the wrong direction entirely for a person merely to hang out washing. I believe Mrs. Hobbs left that wash-house in considerable haste and considerable horror at what she had just done, and in her haste failed to notice that she carried away only one of her gloves and left the other behind on the very table where the whole dreadful business had taken place. "And the letter," Neil said. "If it came from the register office, I think Mrs. Hobbs took it," Miss Marple said. "I think that was in fact very possibly her first object in coming to the wash-house that morning at all. Not murder, not at first, but simply to find and destroy the proof before Agnes could act upon it. I think it was only when she found Agnes unwilling to hand it over, or unwilling to promise silence, that the older, more desperate resolve took hold of her. Panic makes murderers of people who never, in the whole ordinary course of their lives, imagined themselves capable of it, Inspector. I think that is very nearly always the truth of these things, however dramatic they may look from the outside. And I think the very same panic sent her, 3 nights later, to Dinah Colley's cottage window, to finish what the destroyed letter alone could not finish. To see every last scrap of proof removed from the village entirely, so that even if suspicion arose, nothing should remain to confirm it beyond a doubt. "You think she broke in herself, an old woman of 70? "I think it's very possible," Miss Marple said, "or that her son unwittingly assisted her without ever understanding what he carried, or what it meant, for I do not for one moment believe Constable Hobbs guilty of anything beyond a son's natural blindness to a mother's capabilities. It is remarkable, Inspector, how very rarely we credit the quietest people among us with the strength or the cunning to do anything at all out of the ordinary. It is, I think, very largely why they are so rarely suspected, and very largely why, when they do at last act, they so often act with a thoroughness that takes everyone entirely by surprise." Neil looked down at the small grey glove in his hand for a long moment. "It's a great deal of very careful reasoning, Miss Marple," he said at last, "built on a glove, a dropped clothes peg, and an old woman's roses. I believe every word of it, but I'll need rather more than belief before I can charge Winifred Hobbs with murder. I'll need her own words, or something very near it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, setting down the glove with great gentleness, as though it were, in some small way, deserving of respect for the truth it had finally told. "I rather thought you might say that, Inspector, and I think, if you will trust me to arrange it, that I know a way we might obtain exactly that." Chapter 13. The Quiet Test. The gathering Miss Marple arranged for the following Tuesday, exactly a fortnight, as it happened, from the morning Agnes Bartlett died, was, on its surface, nothing more than a small memorial tea, held in the vicarage garden at Miss Marple's own quiet suggestion to the Reverend Pym, in honour of Agnes's passing, before the little community moved on, as communities must, to the ordinary business of living. It was not, of course, nothing more than that at all. Ivy Trelawney came, and her husband Gerald. The Reverend Pym presided with his usual gentle ineffectuality. Nora Willett came, stiff but composed, her secret her own again, now that the true shape of the case had emerged, and left it, mercifully, in shadow. Prue Cardew came, subdued and grateful, no longer eager to point suspicion anywhere at all. Dinah Colley came, pale still, but steadier than she had been, sitting a little apart with the particular careful dignity of a woman who has learned, very recently, exactly who she is and exactly what was taken from her. Inspector Neil came, in plain clothes, ostensibly to pay his own respects, standing near enough to the garden gate to be unobtrusive and near enough to intervene should intervention prove necessary. And Mrs. Winifred Hobbs came, on her son's arm, small and stooped and entirely unremarkable, exactly as she had been unremarkable for 30 years, the invisible woman of the village, the one who tended graves and delivered babies and was thanked, briefly, and then forgotten, while grander and louder people occupied the whole of everyone's attention. Miss Marple, moving among her guests with a plate of small sandwiches, brought the conversation, with the delicate, unhurried skill of 40 years' practice, around at last to the subject everyone had gathered, in some unspoken way, to hear discussed. "It has all been so very sad," she said, to the garden at large, though her eyes rested, for the briefest moment, on Mrs. Hobbs. "And I think what troubles me most in the whole affair is how very ordinary poor Agnes's life must have seemed to everyone, right up until the end, folding linen, keeping her small accounts, tending her cat, when in fact she was carrying, quite alone, the weight of a secret 30 years old, and trying, in her own quiet way, to see a very old wrong finally righted." "A terrible thing," murmured the Reverend Pym, "to carry such a burden alone for so long." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I don't believe, in the end, that she was entirely alone in knowing the truth. I think there was one other person in this village who had known the full truth of Winifred Bartlett's child for 30 years, who had, in fact, been paid very handsomely, once, to ensure that truth was never told at all." The garden had gone very quiet. Even the birds, Miss Marple thought afterward, seemed to have paused in their afternoon chatter. "I wonder," she went on, in the same mild conversational tone, turning now, quite directly, to the small stooped figure on Constable Hobbs's arm, "whether that person has ever truly forgiven herself in 30 years for what was done to that poor dying girl, told, on her own deathbed very nearly, that her child had not survived, when in fact it had been sold away, quite alive, to strangers for the convenience of a wealthy family who did not care to have their name troubled by an inconvenient birth." "Miss Marple," said Constable Hobbs, very white about the mouth, "I don't think my mother—" "Hush, Peter." Mrs. Hobbs's voice, when it came, was very quiet, very steady, and entirely without the tremor her sons had carried. She looked at Miss Marple for a long moment across the vicarage lawn, and something in her old, faded eyes seemed, at last, to give way, not to fear, exactly, but to a weariness 30 years in the gathering. "I never meant Winnie to die believing a lie," she said. "I told myself, at the time, it was a kindness, that a dead child troubled a mother's grief less than a living one given away to strangers she'd never see again. I told myself the Ashworth's money would do more good in a respectable family's hands than in a ruined girl's. I told myself a great many comfortable things, Miss Marple, over 30 years, and I believed almost all of them, most of the time." Her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling now, very slightly. "But when Agnes came to me that Tuesday morning, with that letter in her hand, and told me the child was alive and grown, and that the whole shameful truth of what I'd done was about to come out for the whole village to see, I wasn't thinking of kindness any longer. I was thinking only that I could not bear it. 30 years of being the woman everyone trusted with their most private griefs. Miss Marple, the birthings, the dyings, the secrets nobody else was ever told, and I could not bear to have it all undone in a single afternoon, and to end my days known as nothing but a woman who sold a dying girl's baby for money. And so you silenced her," Neil said quietly, stepping forward now from the gate. "And so I silenced her," Mrs. Hobbs agreed, in a voice gone almost peaceful with the sheer relief, Miss Marple thought, of finally setting the burden down. "It took no more than a minute, Inspector. I've held dying patients still, and held newborns to their first breath, more times than I could ever count in 40 years of nursing. I knew exactly what to do, and exactly how long it would take, and I am ashamed to tell you that in the moment itself I felt almost nothing at all. Only afterward, walking home through the fog with my glove gone missing and my hands shaking so I could hardly manage my own garden gate, did I understand, truly understand, what I had done to a woman who had never once, in 6 years of knowing the truth about me, breathed a word of it to a living soul out of nothing but kindness to an old woman's pride. She looked, then, not at Neil, nor at her own stricken son, but at Dinah Colley, sitting very still and very pale at the edge of the gathering. "I am sorry, child," she said. "I have been sorry every day for 30 years, and I shall go on being sorry for whatever days are left to me. It does not undo what was done, I know that, but I wanted you to hear me say it before they take me away." No one in the garden moved for a long moment. Then Inspector Neal stepped forward, quietly, and did what needed doing, with as much gentleness as the doing of it allowed, and Constable Hobbs, white and silent, walked beside his mother to the gate and helped her, with a son's unthinking tenderness, into the waiting car, as though she were still merely an old woman going out to tend her roses, and not a murderess going to answer, at last, for what 30 years of silence had finally driven her to do. Chapter 14. The Explaining. It fell to Miss Marple some hours later, once Mrs. Hobbs had been taken quietly and without fuss into Inspector Neal's custody, and the shocked, whispering remnants of the vicarage tea party had at last dispersed to carry the news through every cottage in Nether Cumden, to sit with Dinah Colley in Ivy Trelawney's drawing-room and lay out, gently and completely, the whole connected chain of the thing, for Dinah, more than anyone, deserved to hear it plainly, from beginning to end, rather than in the fragments and distortions the village gossip would otherwise deliver to her over the coming weeks. "Your mother," Miss Marple said, "was a good, foolish, trusting girl of 19, who fell in love, or believed she had, with a wealthy man, a good deal older and a good deal more careless than she deserved. When she found herself with child, Reginald Ashworth's family, his mother was living then, and by all accounts a formidable woman, arranged matters in the way such families so often did in those days, quietly, efficiently, and with very little regard for the girl at the centre of it. Mrs. Hobbs, the district nurse, was paid to see the birth managed discreetly, the child placed with a respectable family at a safe distance, and Winifred told, cruelly, needlessly told, that her baby had not survived. And she believed it, Dinah said, very low. She believed it, and died believing it, 2 years later, never knowing I was alive at all. She died believing it, Miss Marple agreed gently. But I do not think, my dear, that she ever stopped grieving for you, whatever she believed of your fate. Grief of that kind does not require certainty to persist. Her sister Agnes, at least, never forgot her, nor the wrong that had been done, though it was not until you came to her door 6 years ago that Agnes learned the full truth herself and began, in her own quiet way, to see that some measure of justice was done. She never told you the truth outright, I think, because she feared, quite reasonably, what it might cost you to know it too soon, before she had gathered enough proof to make the claim beyond any doubt. She was building toward a day, I believe, when she meant to give you not only the truth but the means to hold your head up under it, money enough, perhaps, to feel that the Ashworth family, and Mrs. Hobbs besides, had paid something real for what was taken from your mother, and from you. And instead she died for it, Dinah said, and wept, quietly, into her own hands, while Ivy Trelawney, uncharacteristically silent for once, poured tea that nobody drank, and Miss Marple sat beside the weeping woman and said nothing further at all, judging, correctly, that there are moments when the kindest thing one can offer is simply the patience to sit quietly beside another person's grief until it has, of its own accord, begun to ease. "There is one comfort I can offer you, my dear, if it is a comfort at all," Miss Marple said, after a long while. "Your aunt did not die for nothing. Whatever else is true, the whole shameful arrangement made 30 years ago has now come entirely to light, and cannot be quietly buried again, as it so nearly was. Reginald Ashworth's family will have questions to answer, in time, about the legacy Colonel Hartnell mentioned, and I have very little doubt Mr. Trelawney will see that whatever provision was made for you in Ashworth's will, however small or however carefully hidden, is honoured at last, in full. Agnes spent 6 years building toward a day of reckoning for you. That day has come, my dear, a fortnight too late for her to see it, but it has come. Chapter 15. What the village made of it. The inquest, when it came, some 3 weeks later, was a brief and sober affair, and Mrs. Winifred Hobbs, frail and much aged in the short space of her confinement, made no attempt whatever to deny what she had done, nor to soften the account of it beyond the plain, unadorned truth she had already given in Ivy Trelawney's garden. She was committed for trial, and Nethercomben, in the weeks that followed, did what villages always do, with a horror too large and too close to be comfortably absorbed. It talked the matter thoroughly to pieces, arranged and rearranged its opinions of everyone concerned, and slowly, inexorably, began to fold the whole dreadful business into the ordinary fabric of its collective memory, to be brought out, in years to come, at christenings and funerals alike, as that terrible affair, do you remember, with poor Agnes Bartlett and old Mrs. Hobbs. Colonel Hartnell, to no one's very great surprise, continued for some months to maintain, with the particular stubbornness of a man who dislikes having his first theory publicly overturned, that there had very likely been a tramp involved somewhere in the business, though he grew steadily vaguer as the weeks passed on precisely what part the tramp was supposed to have played. Constable Hobbs, to his very great credit, did not leave the district, though it would have surprised no one had he done so. He applied instead for a transfer to the next parish over, close enough to visit his mother in the months before her trial, far enough that he need not, each morning, walk past the wash-house where she had done what she did. He came to Miss Marple's cottage himself, the evening before he left, to thank her, awkwardly, and at some length for a young man not naturally given to speeches, for having, as he put it, seen the whole thing through to the truth of it, however hard the truth turned out to be. And Miss Marple, seeing how genuinely the boy grieved for a mother he could neither wholly forgive nor wholly stop loving, told him only that she was very sorry indeed for his own part, in a sorrow that was, in the truest sense, none of his making. Nora Willett's own old secret, mercifully, never came to public light at all, Inspector Neale having judged, with a discretion Miss Marple privately thought did him a great deal of credit, that it bore no relation whatever to the murder and need trouble the official record not at all. And Prue Cardew, restored to her usual brisk managing cheerfulness within a month or two, was heard more than once afterward to remark, to anyone who would listen, how very glad she was that her own small trouble had come to nothing worse than a fortnight's fright. Dinah Colley remained in Nethercomben, indeed remained in the very cottage from which her tin box of papers had been stolen. The papers themselves eventually recovered from beneath a loose flagstone in Mrs. Hobbs's own scullery, where the old woman had hidden them rather than destroyed them, unable, even in the depths of what she had done, to bring herself to burn the last proof of a dead girl's child. Dinah had them properly certified, in time, and took, at last, and with a quiet pride that moved even the sharpest tongues in the village to something like respect, the name that had always in truth been hers, Dinah Bartlett, niece to a murdered woman, and grandniece, in the strange, sad turning of the whole affair, to nobody at all who wished to claim her, save the aunt who had loved her enough, in the end, to die for the truth of who she was. Gerald Trelawney, true to Miss Marple's quiet prediction, did indeed uncover, in the course of settling Reginald Ashworth's long-closed estate, a small legacy set aside for W.B.'s child should she ever be found. A legacy the Ashworth solicitors in Bristol had apparently been quietly, and rather guiltily, sitting upon for 3 years, uncertain what to do with a bequest to a person nobody could locate. It came to Dinah, in the end, a good deal later than Agnes had ever intended, but it came. Chapter 16. The Laundry Returned. It was Dinah Colley, in the end, who came to Miss Marple's cottage on a bright, clear morning in early November, the fog long since burned away by a hard autumn frost, carrying, rather to Miss Marple's surprise, a small folded parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. "I found it going through Aunt Agnes's things," Dinah said, setting the parcel on Miss Marple's kitchen table, right at the very bottom of her linen chest, wrapped up separate from everything else. "I think she must have finished it, the very last thing she ever washed, sometime that Monday night, before whatever came in the second post ever reached her hands." Miss Marple unwrapped the paper carefully, and found within it Ivy Trelawney's linen tablecloth, the very one, she realized at once, that had started the whole affair, folded now with the particular crispness Agnes Bartlett had brought to everything she touched, and washed so thoroughly, so painstakingly clean, that no trace remained at all of the old sherry stain that had once marked its hem. "She did wash it, after all," Miss Marple said softly. "She simply never had the chance to send it back." "I thought Mrs. Trelawney ought to have it," Dinah said. "It seemed, I don't know, it seemed important somehow, that it finally got where it was going, that something Aunt Agnes finished, right at the very end, should actually arrive, instead of just stopping." Miss Marple looked at the clean, folded cloth for a long moment, and thought of Agnes Bartlett, working alone in her cold wash-house on a Monday night, scrubbing away the very last ordinary stain she would ever be given the chance to remove, entirely unaware that within a dozen hours her own long, quiet, courageous silence would end not in vindication but in violence, and that the small unfinished task of an unwashed tablecloth would become, of all things, the first thread that unravelled the whole sad tapestry of what had been done to her, and to her sister, and to the daughter neither of them had ever been permitted to raise as their own. "I think," Miss Marple said at last, wrapping the tablecloth again with great gentleness, "that Ivy will be very glad indeed to have it back. And I think, my dear, that you might tell her, when you take it to her, that it was the very last piece of work your Aunt Agnes ever finished, because I believe Ivy will want to know that, and will keep the cloth all the more carefully for knowing it." Dinah nodded, her eyes bright with something that was, at last, closer to peace than to grief, and took up the small parcel and went out into the clear, cold, ordinary morning to carry it home. One small piece of unfinished business, quietly, faithfully completed at last, in a village that would go on, as villages always did, folding its own griefs and secrets away neatly, out of sight, and getting on, however imperfectly, with the ordinary business of living. Miss Marple, left alone in her kitchen, put the kettle on and thought, not for the first time, how very much of human nature could be read, if one only troubled to look closely enough, in the small, unremarkable, everyday things that people did for one another. A folded shirt, a tended grave, a debt quietly paid across 30 years of silence, and how very rarely, in the end, the truth of a person's heart lay in the loud and dramatic things at all, but almost always, instead, in the small, patient, invisible ones. Inspector Neal, calling by some weeks later, once the last of the paperwork had been settled and Mrs. Hobbs's trial date set for the spring assizes, found her in her garden, cutting the last of the autumn chrysanthemums, and could not resist asking, once more, the question that had puzzled him from the very start. "I still find it remarkable," he said, "that you saw the shape of the whole thing from a single dropped glove and a peg in the mud." "Oh, not from those alone, Inspector," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with her usual unhurried care. "Those were only confirmations in the end of something I had begun to suspect a good deal earlier, from the very first day, really, when Mrs. Higgs told me how quiet and unremarkable Agnes Bartlett had always seemed. You see, I have found, over a very long life in villages very like this one, that it is so often the quietest, most overlooked people who see the very most, because nobody troubles to notice them, and so nobody troubles to guard their own secrets in front of them either. A laundress sees a great deal that passes through her hands. So does a district nurse. I think what struck me really, from the very beginning, was that there were two women in the same small village, each of them entirely unremarkable to everyone around them, each of them carrying, quite invisibly, a secret enormous enough to end in murder. It seemed to me, once I had thought of it in those terms, very natural indeed that the two secrets should, in the end, prove to be the very same secret, seen from two quite different sides. And the 6 years' delay, what finally made you certain of the timing? People so rarely change the whole pattern of their conduct without cause, Inspector, said Miss Marple. A woman who has kept silent for 20 years does not, as a rule, suddenly begin demanding payment unless something in her own circumstances or her own conscience has shifted. And what could shift a grieving sister's conscience so profoundly after 20 years of settled grief, except the arrival of the very child she believed lost? It seemed to me the only explanation that fitted every fact together without straining a single one of them. And I have generally found, in my own small experience, that the explanation which requires the least straining is very often the true one, however much less dramatic it may seem at first than some of the alternatives the village prefers to imagine. Inspector Neal smiled faintly into his tea. Colonel Hartnell still maintains it was a tramp, you know. Won't be talked out of it, whatever the papers print. Colonel Hartnell, said Miss Marple placidly, has always preferred a tramp to a neighbour in matters of this kind. I believe most people do. It is so very much more comfortable to imagine that wickedness comes from outside a place one knows well, rather than from within it, from someone one has taken tea with, or bought stamps from, or watched for 30 quiet years, tending roses in the churchyard, and never once suspected of anything worse than an excessive fondness for ivy. She looked out, for a moment, over her own quiet garden, gold in the fading autumn light, and added, in the mild, reflective voice she reserved for the small truths she had learned over a very long life to hold most firmly of all. But it very rarely does come from outside, Inspector, in my experience. It comes almost always from someone perfectly ordinary who has carried something perfectly extraordinary, quite alone, for a very long time, until, one foggy morning, they simply could not carry it any further.